The most dangerous pain is not the one caused by enemies, but the one caused by people an empath trusted with their heart. An empath enters the world differently from most people. While others may simply hear words, an empath feels the emotional weight behind them. They notice the hesitation in someone's voice, the sadness hidden behind forced laughter, the disappointment concealed beneath silence. Their emotional awareness is so intense that they often carry the feelings of others without even realizing it. In the beginning, this sensitivity appears beautiful. People feel understood around them. They feel safe. An empath becomes the person everyone runs to during moments of confusion, heartbreak, anxiety, and emotional collapse. They listen without judgment, comfort without conditions, and give emotional energy without keeping score. But this constant emotional openness creates a dangerous pattern when the empath is repeatedly exposed to pain. Instead of releasing emotional wounds in healthy ways, they slowly begin storing them deep inside themselves. At first, the empath believes understanding people will protect relationships. They think patience can heal disrespect. They think compassion can soften cold behavior. So when someone hurts them, they do not immediately react with anger or distance. Instead, they analyze the situation endlessly. They try to understand why it happened. They excuse behavior that should never have been tolerated. They convince themselves that people are simply struggling, confused, wounded, or emotionally unavailable. Because empaths naturally see the pain inside others, they often ignore the pain growing inside themselves. This becomes emotionally destructive over time. Every insult they remain silent about, every betrayal they forgive too quickly, every disappointment they suppress instead of expressing becomes emotional weight added to an already overwhelmed mind. What makes repeated pain especially dangerous for an empath is that they rarely release emotions immediately. Many people argue, cry, confront, or detach when they are hurt. Empaths often do the opposite. They internalize everything. They replay conversations in their minds late at night. They wonder if they could have communicated better. They question whether they were too emotional, too available, too trusting, or too forgiving. Their mind becomes trapped in cycles of emotional overanalysis. Meanwhile, the pain continues accumulating beneath the surface. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion that affects every part of their life. They may begin feeling mentally drained even after simple social interactions. Crowded environments become overwhelming. Conversations that once felt energizing now feel emotionally heavy. Even small conflicts begin affecting them deeply because their nervous system is already overloaded with unresolved emotional stress. An empath who has been repeatedly hurt often develops invisible emotional fatigue. They may still smile, still help others, still appear calm on the outside, but internally they are carrying years of disappointment that nobody truly noticed. This is why many empaths suddenly withdraw from people without explanation. Others assume they became distant for no reason, but the truth is far more painful. The empath did not suddenly change overnight. They simply reached a point where their emotional capacity could no longer handle constant absorption of negativity, manipulation, dishonesty, and emotional inconsistency. Their silence becomes a form of self-protection because they no longer have the strength to explain wounds that were ignored for too long. Repeated emotional pain also changes the empath physically and psychologically. Stress begins living inside the body. Sleep becomes restless because the mind never truly relaxes. Anxiety increases because the empath becomes hyper-aware of emotional shifts in people around them. They start expecting disappointment, even in healthy situations, because their nervous system has adapted to emotional unpredictability. Simple changes in tone, delayed responses, or emotional distance from others can trigger deep overthinking. The empath becomes emotionally alert at all times, constantly scanning for signs of rejection, dishonesty, or abandonment. This is not weakness, It is what happens when a deeply sensitive person experiences repeated emotional injuries without enough healing, reassurance, or emotional safety. One of the most tragic parts of this transformation is that empaths often continue giving love while silently breaking inside. Even after being hurt repeatedly, they still try to support others. They still care deeply, they still want harmony in relationships. But every act of emotional giving slowly drains them further because they are pouring energy from a heart that has not fully healed. Eventually, the empath begins feeling emotionally disconnected from themselves. They become so focused on understanding everyone else's emotions that they lose connection with their own needs, boundaries, and inner peace. Their emotional world becomes crowded with unspoken pain, unresolved memories, suppressed anger, and silent grief that nobody ever truly recognized. One of the deepest psychological effects repeated emotional pain has on an empath is the slow destruction of self-worth. This process does not happen suddenly. It happens quietly, gradually, and almost invisibly. In the beginning, the empath still believes in the goodness of people. They still believe love, patience, honesty, and emotional effort will eventually be appreciated. When someone hurts them, they rarely respond with immediate blame or anger. Instead, they look inward. They analyze themselves before analyzing the other person. They ask whether they misunderstood something, whether they were too emotional, too available, too trusting, or too sensitive. This constant habit of self-examination becomes dangerous when the empath is repeatedly exposed to emotionally harmful relationships because eventually they stop questioning the behavior of others and begin questioning their own value. An empath naturally gives people the benefit of the doubt. They are emotionally wired to understand pain, insecurity, and human imperfection. Because of this, they often tolerate behavior that emotionally healthy people would reject immediately. They forgive disrespect because they understand trauma. They excuse inconsistency because they understand fear. They tolerate emotional neglect because they understand emotional confusion. But while they continue making excuses for others, they silently absorb emotional damage themselves. Over time, every broken promise, every ignored feeling, every moment of emotional abandonment begins creating a painful internal message. Maybe I am not enough to be treated better. This thought slowly grows stronger with every repeated disappointment. The empath starts comparing the love they give with the treatment they receive. They notice how deeply they listen to others while nobody truly listens to them. They notice how easily people come to them for comfort but disappear when the empath needs emotional support. They begin realizing that their kindness is often taken for granted instead of valued. Yet instead of becoming angry immediately, many empaths become self-critical. They wonder why their efforts never seem enough to inspire loyalty, consistency, or emotional safety in return. This creates a painful emotional conflict because empaths usually tie their identity to how much they can emotionally give to others. When relationships repeatedly fail despite their efforts, they begin believing there must be something wrong with them personally. Repeated emotional hurt slowly changes the empath's internal dialogue. They may begin appearing confident externally while privately battling thoughts of inadequacy. They start asking themselves painful questions late at night when nobody is around to hear their thoughts. Why do people always leave? Why do I care more than others? Why am I never enough for the people I love? These thoughts become emotionally exhausting because empaths feel rejection deeply. What others brush off in minutes can stay in an empath's mind for weeks or even years. Their emotional memory is intense. They replay conversations repeatedly, analyzing details, searching for what they could have done differently. This constant emotional replay creates anxiety, insecurity, and eventually emotional self-doubt. One of the saddest transformations repeated pain causes is that the empath begins shrinking themselves to avoid future rejection. The person who once expressed emotions openly now becomes cautious. They stop sharing their feelings fully because vulnerability no longer feels safe. They begin suppressing parts of their personality to avoid being misunderstood or abandoned. Some become quieter in relationships. Others stop asking for reassurance because they fear appearing needy. Many empaths eventually convince themselves that expecting emotional consistency is asking for too much. They settle for emotional crumbs because repeated disappointment lowered their expectations of what love should feel like. This emotional self-doubt affects every area of the empath's life. They may struggle to trust compliments because deep down they no longer feel worthy of genuine appreciation. They overthink small changes in behavior because they secretly fear abandonment. They apologize excessively even when they did nothing wrong because they became conditioned to believe they are somehow responsible for maintaining emotional harmony at all times. Their self-esteem becomes tied to how useful, helpful, or emotionally available they are to others. When they cannot fix someone's problems or save a relationship from falling apart, they often feel personal failure instead of recognizing mutual responsibility. The empath also begins fearing their own emotional depth. After being repeatedly hurt, they may start believing their sensitivity is a weakness rather than a gift. Society often praises emotional detachment while treating deep emotional vulnerability as something excessive. Because of this, the empath may begin suppressing the very qualities that once made them emotionally beautiful. They stop trusting their heart. They become afraid of caring too much again because every previous experience taught them that intense emotional investment often leads to pain, disappointment, and emotional exhaustion. One of the most misunderstood things about an empath is that repeated pain rarely destroys their ability to care. Even after betrayal, disappointment, emotional neglect, and heartbreak, the empath usually continues carrying kindness within them. They still notice when someone is struggling. They still feel compassion when others are hurting. They still want peace, honesty, emotional connection, and genuine love. But while their heart may remain soft, their trust slowly transforms into something far more cautious. This change happens after they have experienced too many situations where their loyalty was taken for granted, their vulnerability was used against them, and their emotional openness became an invitation for manipulation instead of mutual respect. In the beginning, an empath trusts naturally. They believe people mean what they say. They believe effort reflects sincerity. They believe emotional connection creates emotional responsibility. Because they themselves are deeply genuine, they assume others value honesty in the same way. This is why empaths often become emotionally invested very quickly in relationships, friendships, and even simple human connections. They listen deeply, support fully, and emotionally show up in ways many people are not used to experiencing. But repeated emotional wounds slowly teach them a painful lesson. Not everyone values a pure heart, and not everyone handles emotional access responsibly. The empath eventually realizes that some people are attracted to their energy not because they truly love them, but because they benefit from the emotional comfort, validation, and understanding the empath provides. This realization changes something profound inside them. They begin recognizing how often they were emotionally available for people who were never equally available in return. They notice how some individuals only appeared during moments of need but disappeared during moments when the empath required support themselves. They start understanding that many people enjoy receiving deep emotional care while having no intention of offering the same depth back. This awareness becomes emotionally painful because empaths naturally believe relationships should involve reciprocity, emotional honesty, and mutual effort. As repeated disappointment accumulates, the empath's intuition becomes sharper than ever before. They begin observing behavior more carefully instead of blindly trusting words. Small inconsistencies that they once ignored now stand out clearly. They notice changes in tone, lack of emotional effort, forced affection, hidden resentment, emotional manipulation disguised as concern, and insincerity hidden beneath charming behavior. Pain forces the empath to become emotionally observant because previous experiences taught them the danger of ignoring red flags. Their kindness remains, but innocence disappears. They stop assuming everyone has good intentions simply because they themselves do. This transformation often surprises people around them. Those who once knew the empath as endlessly forgiving suddenly encounter someone more reserved, emotionally selective, and difficult to access. The empath no longer gives unlimited emotional energy immediately. Instead of trusting quickly, they take time observing character, consistency, and emotional maturity. They begin protecting parts of themselves they once shared freely. Conversations become more guarded. Emotional vulnerability becomes rare, not because they stopped feeling deeply, but because experience taught them that emotional exposure without safety leads to suffering. Every betrayal left behind lessons the empath cannot simply erase from memory. One of the deepest internal changes repeated pain creates is that the empath becomes aware of how dangerous their own compassion can be when boundaries are absent. In the past, they believed understanding someone's pain meant staying no matter how poorly they were treated. They confused empathy with emotional self-sacrifice. They thought love meant enduring endless disappointment while hoping the other person would eventually change. But after repeated emotional damage, they begin realizing that understanding someone's trauma does not excuse toxic behavior. They learn that compassion without boundaries invites emotional destruction. This realization permanently changes the way they trust people because now they understand that emotional closeness must be earned, not freely handed to everyone who asks for it. The empath also begins trusting actions more than words. They have heard too many promises that were never fulfilled, too many apologies followed by repeated behavior, too many declarations of love without consistency, accountability, or emotional effort behind them. Over time, this creates emotional caution that becomes part of their personality. They no longer feel impressed by charm, intense attention, or temporary affection. Instead, they look for stability, honesty, respect, emotional presence, and behavioral consistency over time. Their standards rise not out of arrogance, but out of survival. They understand now that protecting their emotional peace is necessary because every previous experience taught them how devastating emotional betrayal can become for someone who feels everything deeply. Even though their trust changes forever, the empath still quietly hopes genuine connection exists. Beneath the caution, there remains a desire to love openly without fear. But repeated hurt taught them that not everyone deserves unrestricted access to their emotional world, their vulnerability, their patience, or the depth of care they naturally carry within themselves. One of the most painful transformations an empath experiences after repeated emotional hurt is the shift from emotional openness to emotional detachment. This change rarely happens suddenly. It is not a dramatic decision made in a single moment of anger. Instead, it develops slowly after months or years of emotional exhaustion, disappointment, overgiving, and silent suffering. At first, the empath continues trying to fix everything. They communicate, forgive, explain, comfort, and emotionally invest themselves again and again, believing that enough love and patience can repair almost any relationship. But eventually, there comes a point where the emotional burden becomes too heavy for even the kindest heart to carry. The empath begins realizing they are constantly pouring emotional energy into people and situations that leave them feeling drained instead of emotionally safe. An empath feels emotional tension deeply. Conflict does not simply pass through them the way it does for many others. Harsh words linger in their mind for days. Emotional inconsistency creates anxiety. Silence feels heavy. Rejection feels personal. Because they absorb emotional energy intensely, unhealthy relationships affect them on every level, mentally, emotionally, and even physically. When someone repeatedly hurts them, the empath does not simply forget and move on. Their nervous system remains affected long after the moment has passed. This constant emotional overstimulation eventually creates exhaustion so severe that the empath no longer has the emotional strength to keep reacting, explaining, or fighting for connection in the same way they once did. At the beginning of emotional exhaustion, the empath still tries to maintain relationships. They tell themselves things will improve. They continue giving second chances. They continue hoping people will eventually recognize their emotional value and reciprocate the same level of care. But every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every emotionally one-sided interaction slowly weakens their emotional resilience. They become tired of always being the understanding one, the patient one, the forgiving one, and the emotionally available one. They begin noticing how often their own emotional needs are overlooked while they continuously prioritize the emotional comfort of everyone around them. This realization creates deep internal fatigue because the empath finally sees how much of themselves they have sacrificed in order to keep relationships functioning. As emotional exhaustion grows, the empath slowly stops reacting the way they once did. The person who used to express pain openly becomes quieter. The person who once fought to save relationships begins withdrawing emotionally. This is the stage where many people mistakenly believe the empath has become cold or emotionally distant by choice. In reality, the empath is emotionally depleted. They have spent so much time carrying emotional weight that their mind and body begin protecting themselves through detachment. Emotional numbness becomes a survival response. Their heart still feels deeply, but they no longer have the strength to constantly expose those feelings in environments that repeatedly wounded them. One of the clearest signs of this transformation is that the empath stops chasing emotional connection. In the past, they may have over-explained themselves, tried to repair misunderstandings immediately, or desperately attempted to hold relationships together. But emotional exhaustion teaches them a painful lesson. Relationships cannot survive through one-sided effort alone. Eventually, they stop forcing conversations that feel emotionally empty. They stop begging people to communicate honestly. They stop trying to convince others to value them properly. Not because they stopped caring, but because they realized constant emotional pursuit was destroying their inner peace. This emotional detachment often feels confusing even to the empath themselves. They may notice they no longer react emotionally to situations that once deeply affected them. Messages go unanswered longer. Emotional drama becomes intolerable. Social interaction feels overwhelming. The empath who once wanted deep emotional closeness may suddenly crave solitude and silence instead. This happens because their nervous system has become overloaded from prolonged emotional stress. Isolation begins feeling safer than connection because solitude no longer demands emotional labor, emotional performance, or emotional survival. Repeated emotional pain also changes the empath's perspective on love and relationships. They begin understanding that love without emotional safety eventually becomes emotionally dangerous. They realize that constantly sacrificing their own needs in order to maintain harmony only leads to resentment, burnout, and internal emptiness. This awareness forces them to emotionally withdraw from situations where they no longer feel respected, appreciated, or emotionally protected. What others interpret as indifference is often the empath finally choosing self-preservation after years of emotional depletion. The empath eventually becomes emotionally selective because they can no longer afford to give unlimited emotional access to people who continuously drain their spirit. They begin protecting their time, energy, peace, and emotional stability with far greater caution than before. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel exhausting if they lack sincerity. Relationships built on inconsistency lose their emotional appeal. The empath starts valuing calmness more than intensity, emotional safety more than temporary passion, and inner peace more than external validation. One of the most powerful transformations repeated emotional pain creates inside an empath is the development of strong emotional boundaries. In the beginning of their journey, most empaths struggle deeply with boundaries because their natural instinct is to help, understand, forgive, and emotionally support others without limitation. They often believe love means endless patience. They believe kindness means always being available. They believe caring for others requires sacrificing their own emotional comfort if necessary. Because of this mindset, empaths frequently allow people to cross emotional lines that should never have been tolerated. They excuse disrespect, ignore emotional manipulation, overlook inconsistency, and continue giving chances long after the relationship has become emotionally harmful. Not because they are weak, but because their compassion constantly pushes them to see the wounded side of people rather than the damage those people are causing. At first, the empath feels guilty whenever they try to protect themselves. Saying no feels uncomfortable. Creating emotional distance feels selfish. Limiting access to their energy feels cruel. They are so used to prioritizing the emotional needs of others that they rarely stop to ask themselves an important question: who is protecting me? This absence of boundaries slowly creates emotional burnout because the empath becomes emotionally available to everyone while receiving very little emotional protection in return. People begin depending on the empath's kindness without considering the emotional cost. Some individuals unconsciously drain them, while others intentionally take advantage of their forgiving nature. Over time, the empath realizes they are constantly emotionally exhausted because they have allowed too many people unrestricted access to their peace, time, emotions, and mental energy. Repeated emotional pain becomes the harsh teacher that finally forces the empath to understand the necessity of boundaries. Betrayals teach them that not everyone values loyalty. Manipulation teaches them that kindness attracts both healthy and unhealthy people. Emotional neglect teaches them that constantly giving more will not force others to care properly. Slowly, the empath begins recognizing patterns they once ignored. They notice how certain people only contact them when they need emotional support, validation, attention, or comfort. They notice how some relationships leave them feeling emotionally drained instead of emotionally nourished. They begin understanding that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. This realization changes the empath profoundly. The same person who once tolerated emotional inconsistency now becomes far more selective about who enters their emotional world. They begin protecting their energy carefully because experience taught them how dangerous emotional overexposure can become. The empath starts saying no without excessive explanation. They stop feeling responsible for fixing every broken person who enters their life. They begin distancing themselves from emotionally chaotic environments, manipulative personalities, and one-sided relationships that constantly demand emotional labor without offering stability or respect in return. To outsiders, this transformation can appear shocking. People who once benefited from the empath's unlimited patience may accuse them of changing, becoming distant, selfish, cold, or difficult. But what they fail to understand is that the empath is no longer operating from emotional innocence. They are operating from painful experience. Every boundary the empath creates is usually built from a wound that taught them what happens when emotional access is given too freely. Their caution is not cruelty. Their distance is not hatred. Their boundaries are survival mechanisms created after years of emotional exhaustion and disappointment. Strong boundaries also change the way the empath communicates. In the past, they may have avoided confrontation out of fear of hurting others or creating conflict. They may have remained silent while their feelings were ignored simply to maintain peace. But after repeated hurt, they begin valuing honesty over emotional self-sacrifice. They stop suppressing discomfort to keep others comfortable. They become clearer about what they will and will not tolerate emotionally. If someone repeatedly disrespects their feelings, violates trust, manipulates emotions, or brings constant instability into their life, the empath becomes far more willing to walk away instead of endlessly trying to repair the situation alone. One of the most important lessons the empath eventually learns is that boundaries do not block love. They protect healthy love from becoming emotional chaos. Without boundaries, relationships become environments where the empath constantly overgives while others continuously take. Boundaries create emotional balance. They allow the empath to care deeply without abandoning themselves in the process. They learn that protecting their emotional well-being is not selfishness, but responsibility. They realize they can still be compassionate without allowing people to emotionally consume them. As these boundaries strengthen, the empath becomes emotionally harder to manipulate. Guilt no longer controls them as easily. Emotional games become more visible. Empty apologies lose their power when behavior never changes. The empath stops confusing emotional intensity with genuine love and begins prioritizing consistency, accountability, honesty, and emotional maturity instead. Their standards rise because suffering taught them the cost of accepting less than they deserve. There comes a moment in the life of an empath when pain stops breaking them and begins transforming them. Before this transformation, the empath often spends years emotionally overwhelmed by disappointment, betrayal, rejection, and emotional exhaustion. They give endlessly, forgive repeatedly, and continue hoping that their kindness will eventually be understood and valued by the people around them. For a long time, they carry emotional wounds silently because they believe love means endurance. They believe staying gentle in a harsh world is proof of emotional strength. But repeated suffering slowly changes the empath's inner world in ways that become impossible to ignore. Eventually, the pain becomes so intense that it forces them to confront a truth they spent years avoiding. Constantly sacrificing themselves for others is not love, it is emotional self-abandonment. This realization becomes the beginning of the empath's awakening. Instead of continuing to lose themselves in unhealthy relationships and emotionally draining environments, they begin turning inward for the first time. They stop asking why others failed to value them and start asking why they accepted treatment that continuously damaged their peace. This shift is powerful because the empath finally understands that their emotional sensitivity was never the real problem. The real problem was giving unlimited emotional access to people who lacked emotional responsibility, emotional maturity, or genuine respect for the depth of care being offered to them. As the empath awakens emotionally, they begin reconnecting with parts of themselves they ignored for years. During periods of emotional overgiving, many empaths lose touch with their own identity because they become consumed by the needs, emotions, and problems of others. They spend so much time trying to heal people, save relationships, and maintain emotional harmony that they forget to care for their own inner world. But pain eventually forces self-reflection. The empath begins understanding their own patterns, emotional triggers, insecurities, and unmet needs more clearly than ever before. They start recognizing how often they confused emotional suffering with loyalty and emotional sacrifice with love. This awakening creates emotional intelligence that becomes one of the empath's greatest strengths. Because they have experienced deep emotional pain personally, they develop extraordinary insight into human behavior, emotional manipulation, insecurity, trauma, and emotional dishonesty. They become highly intuitive, not from fantasy or illusion, but from experience. Repeated betrayal teaches them how to recognize false intentions. Repeated disappointment teaches them how to identify inconsistency. Repeated emotional neglect teaches them the importance of emotional presence and sincerity. Their suffering sharpens their awareness of people, relationships, and emotional energy in ways that make them far wiser than before. One of the most beautiful aspects of this transformation is that the empath no longer seeks validation from people who cannot emotionally understand them. In the past, they may have desperately wanted others to recognize their worth, appreciate their sacrifices, and reciprocate the same emotional depth they constantly provided. But after awakening, they stop chasing external approval so intensely. They begin validating themselves internally. They realize their kindness does not lose value simply because someone failed to appreciate it. Their emotional depth does not become weakness simply because others lack the emotional capacity to handle it responsibly. This new version of the empath becomes emotionally stronger without losing compassion. That is what makes their transformation so powerful. They do not become cruel. They do not become emotionally numb forever. Instead, they become balanced. They learn how to love without abandoning themselves. They learn how to care without tolerating disrespect. They learn how to support others without carrying responsibility for everyone's emotional healing. This balance allows the empath to finally experience a kind of emotional freedom they never had before. The awakened empath also becomes far more selective about relationships. They no longer feel attracted to emotional chaos, inconsistency, or one-sided emotional dynamics. Peace becomes more valuable than intensity. Authenticity becomes more attractive than charm. Emotional safety becomes more important than temporary emotional excitement. The empath starts building relationships based on mutual respect, honesty, emotional accountability, and genuine connection rather than emotional dependency or unhealthy attachment patterns. Pain also teaches the empath resilience they never knew they possessed. After surviving emotional heartbreak, betrayal, abandonment, manipulation, and disappointment, they begin understanding their own strength differently. They realize they survived situations that once felt impossible to endure. This realization creates quiet confidence within them. They stop fearing loneliness as much because they learned how to survive emotional isolation already. They stop fearing rejection as deeply because they understand their worth no longer depends on being chosen by people incapable of loving them properly. The empath eventually discovers that their greatest power was never their ability to save others. Their true power is their ability to remain emotionally deep, compassionate, self-aware, and loving despite everything they endured without allowing the world's cruelty to destroy the goodness within them.